Well, good to be with you folks tonight. Judy is not here. I told several folks that she is teaching a vacation Bible school class at the church where our daughter-in-law and son go. They're doing an interesting thing with vacation Bible school. They're not having it at the building. They're having it throughout neighborhoods in different people's yards. And so our daughter-in-law, Sarah, I think Judy said they had 10 children. 4 of them were all related to us, and the rest of them were neighbors, I guess. And so Judy is the Bible story lady, so that's where she is tonight. She missed being here, but she is glad to be able to help out with that. Okay. Our study tonight is very appropriate for what we're going through in this day and time with all the problems that we're facing. It's very appropriate for what we're going through with our age, and you hear prayer requests and the kinds of things that are happening. It's in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. James 5, 7 through 12. Let me read it for you. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no, no, or you will be condemned. Now, James is talking about how we face suffering. And I think that's a very appropriate thing because I know that when you're hurting or when you're sick or when you've got something like this weird virus that's going on, you really have to stop and think, how are you going to handle it? What am I going to say? What am I going to do? What should I do? And I think James gives us some very practical advice that I hope will be helpful for all of us this evening. So, number 1, James has talked about how the rich have oppressed the poor. And you may remember in our previous section, he talked about how the rich have oppressed the poor, even withheld their wages. Now he is possibly talking to those who have been defrauded by the rich. So he says, be patient then, brothers. So he's talked about the rich in the previous section, what they did, how they cheated their workers, all of that kind of thing. Now he's kind of switching, and he's not talking about the rich or to the rich. He seems to be talking to those who have been defrauded by the rich. Let me give you one again. James has talked about how the rich have oppressed the poor. That's in chapter 2 and in chapter 5. Now he is possibly talking to those who have been defrauded by the rich. Now notice I say possibly, because James doesn't say you who have been defrauded by the rich. He doesn't call them that. I'm just kind of assuming that. So here we begin to talk about what James is teaching us of how we are to face problems, difficulty, circumstances, whatever. Number 2, James says, be patient. Oh, anybody wish that he didn't say that? You've heard the guy that said, I prayed, Lord, give me patience, and I want it right now. Patience is a hard thing, especially when you're going through a long-term situation. I've not been real patient with this virus thing. I'm ready for it to be gone and over with. I've quit listening to the news. I've just gotten tired of over and over again repeating almost the same thing. But James teaches me, be patient. So number 2, James says, be patient. He is talking about how we face difficult circumstances. He is talking about how we face difficult circumstances. Now, I want to say this. Difficult circumstances could be a variety of things. It could be physical illness. It could be persecution these people were going through. It could be unemployment, financial problems. Could be family problems, whatever. The truth is we live in a broken world, and the truth is that we are going to face difficult circumstances. They happen. They happen to good people. They happen to bad people. But James says, be patient. Now, I want you to look at chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 in James, because he kind of says the same thing in different places. Verses 3 and 4, he says, verse 3, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish his work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And then in verse 12, he says, of chapter 1, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. So now he comes in chapter 5, verse 7, be patient. But then if you notice down a little farther, he talks about verse 11, blessed are those who have persevered. So I want to do a quick little Bible study here, or word study, excuse me. Under 2, he uses the word perseverance in 5:7, the word patience. These words are very similar in meaning. Now, let me give you a simple little couple of word definition. Perseverance implies heroic endurance. Heroic endurance. While patience implies quietly suffering without complaint. Perseverance, you could just say endurance if you wanted to. You know, you persevere, you endure. But patience is something you do quietly without complaint. What do you think about that? Have you experienced where somebody says to you, how you doing? You know, that's a normal greeting. And you really don't tell the truth? Because we tend to not want to deal with our problems. We tend to, we want to look good. We want to feel good. And we want people to know we're okay. I don't think James is saying here, pretend that you're not having a problem. Now let me tell you why I believe that. Beginning in verse 15 of chapter 5, he talks about, or verse 13, he talks about what to do if you're sick. He says you call for the elders of the church. So James is not saying don't ask for help when you need help. And I think that's a critical issue in the church today. I think somehow people have gotten the idea, okay, I've got to get looking good for church to everybody else when really I'm hurting inside. And I think that's a mistake. As a matter of fact, I think one reason why some people don't attend church is because they think everybody at church has got it all together. Truth is, everybody in church doesn't have it all together. And we have good days, we have bad days, some days worse than others. But James is talking about, I think, something different. I don't think James is talking about pretending that you're okay when you're not. On the other hand, if you say something to somebody and say, how you doing, and they spend a half hour telling you about some minor little issues, that's a whole different problem. And so I think we have to learn a proper balance, that we deal with our problems personally, but when we need help, we ask for help. So James talks about those. This is 2b. Perseverance implies heroic endurance. Patience implies quietly suffering without complaint. Number 3, verse 7, James says those who are suffering learn to wait. Learn to wait. Now, that's the problem. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. So what James is doing, he's saying, in the face of your suffering, learn to wait. And then he uses the example of the farmer. I love examples or illustrations. His illustration is, let's see how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. So number 4, James' example is that of a farmer who must work, but also must depend on God. James' example is that of a farmer who must work, but also must depend on God. Now, I take that example to mean this. In our problems and sufferings, there are things we're supposed to do. There are things we're supposed to do in our problems and suffering. If you're sick, take the medicine. Okay? If you are hurting, seek counseling. If you are afraid, try to find the source of your fear. There are things we are to do. But at the same time, we are to depend on God. We are to trust God. And here again, there is that balance. There are some people who try to do it all themselves. I can take care of myself. There are other people who say, I'm just going to trust the Lord, and I'm not going to take the medicine. Or I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm not going to do anything. I think faith without works is dead. And I think we have a responsibility to do our part. I remember very, very well, and I've probably told you this before because one of those many favorite stories, when Dee first started having some of her problems with her vision. She was 3. Right, Dee? 3? 3?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And a lot of people were praying for her, and I got a call from a preacher, and he said, Drew, let me ask you a question. He said, do you have a good doctor? And I said, yeah. He said, what about the hospital you're going to? Is it a good hospital? I said, yes. He said, do you feel confident with the medical advice you're getting? And we said, yeah, we really do. He said, okay, you've done your work. Now you trust God. And that really helped me. I appreciate what he said. He didn't just call and say, all you got to do is trust God and everything's going to be fine. He didn't say that. He said, here are some things you can do. And I believe that God provides people in our lives to help us in particular situations. I believe God has a wonderful way of providing people with gifts or talents or whatever that can meet needs that we can't do ourselves. And so our responsibility is to find those people, whether it be a good doctor, a good hospital, whatever. But then our responsibility also is to do what we are to do ourselves, but then trust God. And that's our work and our faith together. Okay? So what James is illustrating with the farmer, what does the farmer do? He has to do his work. You know, if a farmer says, I'm just going to trust God that the crops will grow and he never plants anything, I'm not much of a farmer, but I know he's not going to get anything. He's got to do his work, but then he's got to trust God for the rains. And you may remember that there's an Old Testament scripture that says seed time and harvest will last through the whole world. Okay? God will provide. All right, any questions so far or comments?
I've heard an expression before, you probably heard it too, that says that if you help somebody more than helping themselves, you probably do too much.
Yep.
Maybe somewhat apply to this too, you know. Like I say, somebody's waiting back, so someone take care of me type thing, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And there is always our personal responsibility that we need to look at. On the other hand, there are times when we can't handle it. We can't handle it. And we need others. We need help. And I think one of the best things that could happen in the church is when people feel comfortable that when they are in a critical situation and they've done all they can do, they need to be able to say help and know that the church and or Christian people will be there for them. Makes a big difference. Okay? All right, now James goes on. Number 5. The reason a Christian can suffer in silence is because the Lord is coming. Notice what James says. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Now that'll create a little discussion in just a moment. Okay? But number 5, the reason a Christian can suffer in silence is because the Lord is coming and he will make all things right. This is a broken world, but when he comes, he will make all things right. This is not a fair world, but when he comes, he will make all things right. That is a tremendous hope. Now, James makes a comment that creates some discussion. He says in the last part of verse 8, because the Lord's coming is near. Now, I think there are two ways to look at that. Both of them are good. I think one way to look at that is that the people in the New Testament times thought that Jesus was going to come during their lifetime. That's obvious. We find that in several places, and James seemed to believe that. Now, he is not given a date. He's not given a prophecy. He just believed the Lord was going to come soon. And that was a good belief for them. But I want you to hear the second thing, and this is number 6. The Lord's coming is near is a true statement for all generations. Let me repeat that again. The Lord's coming is near is a true statement for all generations. In other words, it was a true statement for James. It's a true statement for us. Listen to this last part. It is an attitude of expectation, not a statement of a date. The Lord's coming is near is a true statement for all generations. It is an attitude of expectation, not a statement of a date. So in James's day, or Paul's, or anyone at that time, it was legitimate for them to say, because Jesus could have come during their time. And for them to say, the Lord's coming is near is a legitimate statement. But it would also be all right for us to say it. And James wasn't wrong, because Jesus could have come at that time. And Jesus could come in our time. He may not come for another 500 years. We don't know. But again, it's an attitude that we look at the reality of the fact that the coming of Jesus could happen at any time. And what James is talking about is to understand the reason we can deal with some of our hardships is because there is going to come a time when Jesus is going to come and he is going to make all things right. Okay, questions or comments? Sometime when you have a lot of time, talk to Dee about heaven and the second coming. She'll tell you all kinds of stories about what she knows. She was telling me the other day, she said, Dad, I'm going to be able to outrun you when we get to heaven. So she has all kinds of stories about heaven. All right, now we move into something now with verse 9 that I've got to be careful how I approach it because I don't want anybody to misunderstand. In verse 9, James says, don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Don't grumble. Number 7, verse 9 is a warning. Verse 9 is a warning. Now, if you back up in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, James has said, brothers, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? Now, let's come back to chapter 5. James has been talking about suffering. Now, you might think, well, James has shifted his subject, and he's shifted from suffering to grumbling. I don't think so. I think he's dealing with the same thing. So let's look at the rest of number 7. Our words matter. Verse 9 is a warning. C4, verse 11, 12. Our words matter. In our problems and suffering, it is easy to take it out on others. In our problems and suffering, it is easy to take it out on others. It's this kind of thing, I'm hurting, how dare you be happy when I'm hurting, so I'm going to share my hurt with you so that you'll hurt with me. It's easy to do that. Now, if you've never heard this last sentence, it's good for you to learn. It is sad but true that often hurting people hurt people. It is sad but often true that hurting people hurt people. I probably have seen that more in dealing with people going through grief with a death. And I'm very understanding about that. Okay, I don't get upset. I remember back a long time ago, a lady whose father died. And she really, really got angry with the church. She just could not believe that we didn't do more for her at the death of her father. I mean, she was really, really angry and expressed her anger to me. And I understood what she was doing. She wasn't mad at me. She wasn't mad at the church. She was mad at God. She was mad at God. Well, what do you do when you're mad at God? Well, you attack the thing you can get closest to. Well, she got over it. But I understood what was going on with her. That was part of the grieving process. If you've talked about the steps of grief, you understand one of the steps is anger. And sometimes people get angry at God. Sometimes they get angry at the person who died. Sometimes they get angry at the doctor who didn't take better care of them, whatever it may be. But the truth is, when people are hurting, sometimes they then inflict pain on other people. And I really think that's what James is talking about here. James is warning us to be careful. Now again, this is not saying don't ask for help. This is not saying we don't tell people what's going on in our lives. It's not saying that at all. But I think there's a difference in how we deal with it. If my pain causes me to attack you, that's not right. If my pain causes me to ask you for help or for prayers or for assistance or for sympathy, I think that's a different thing. Does that make sense? Is that clear? So just remember this phrase when you see somebody who's hurting somebody else, there's a real good possibility that they're hurting themselves. I heard something, it's been just within the last couple of years that really caused me to stop and think about how to deal with a lot of broken people. Somebody, and I don't remember where I heard it or where I read it, I may have read it, said that when we're looking at somebody whose life is a mess, we can see their sin because it's obvious. But what we can't see is how they were sinned against at some point in their life. That really helped me stop and think, because sometimes I look at someone who's just making a mess of their life, and you want to say, what's wrong? But then I have to stop and think, maybe something happened at some time in the past that has impacted them so negatively that this is causing this kind of behavior. And so this is kind of like the idea again, hurting people hurt people. Okay, questions? Thank you, Dee. Okay, number 8. Notice who hears when we grumble. Number 8, notice who hears when we grumble. What did James say? The judge is standing at the door. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been talking about somebody and you find out that they're listening? I really have a good friend. This was back some years ago. And I had gone into his office and he said, well, Drew, what do you think about it? And he started to ask me questions about my brother-in-law, Carlos, who happened to be one of my very good friends and one of my best friends. And he said, he's kind of a mess, isn't he? And I'm thinking, this was just a kind of a friendly conversation. And I said, he's okay. I hear this laughing behind me. They had set this up, and he was standing behind me, behind the door. Seriously. And I thought, oh boy, I could have really put my foot in my mouth. Fortunately, I didn't. But the idea is, okay, maybe I need to remember that Jesus is standing right at the door. And when I grumble or when I complain or when I talk about others, it's the judge who hears. See, folks, the whole point, James says this throughout the book, our words matter. It's such an easy thing to say things without thinking. It's such an easy thing to just ramble. Some of us are more talkers than others. And if we're not careful, our speech can get us in trouble. Have you noticed over the last, what's it been, the last couple of years, how many people, and recently here, how many people are losing jobs because of things they've said that are inappropriate? Maybe a racial comment, maybe a sexual innuendo, some kind of accusation. How many times people are getting in trouble because of their words? And again, our words matter. Okay, so James gives us an illustration in verse 10. He says, brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Number 9, verse 10, remember even God's special prophets suffered. That's what James is saying. You're not above suffering. Remember, even God's special prophets suffered. And you might add to that, and so did God's Son. And so did God's Son. This may give you something to think about. We are not exempt from pain, nor was God, which is kind of amazing. He did not choose to exempt himself from pain. He watched his Son die. And when I remember that, it helps me in my problems to realize even the perfect God understands suffering. And the Bible says Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered. So we understand that we have that illustration to help us when we face problems. All right, number 9, verse 10, remember even God's special prophets suffered. Number 10, he uses another illustration in verse 11. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. All right, number 10, Job himself is only mentioned here in the New Testament. It's the only mention of Job in the New Testament, is right here in the book of James. Now, read Job, though, and you find that Job didn't necessarily handle his problems well. He complained to God. And I don't think James is saying, look at Job, who handled his suffering perfectly. Job didn't. But, you know what? I think it's okay to complain to God. If I may use a physical illustration, I believe God has broad shoulders. He can handle our complaints. I believe that if our doubts or our fears or our complaints drive us to God, that's good. Now, if they are something that drives us away from God, that's a problem. If a person is struggling with doubts and those doubts drive him to search for God, that's good. That's wonderful. And so Job complained. And so what James is doing, though, is talking about this matter not of patience so much as perseverance. So let me give you 10. Job is only mentioned here in the New Testament. Read Job and you find that he complained to God. But James here is talking about Job's heroic endurance. There's that phrase again. And remember I mentioned that up in 1b. Job's heroic endurance. Job endured all that Satan threw at him. So I think what James is saying, look how Job endured. He handled it. He handled it happily, but he handled it. And he was faithful. And then, of course, Job, the last part of verse 11, Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. Verse 11, Job's prosperity was returned and even increased. God's people will not suffer forever. When Jesus comes, he will make all things right. Job's prosperity was returned and even increased. God's people will not suffer forever. When Jesus comes, he will make all things right. Okay, so we've got a little discussion here. Number 12. How has the present situation in our world, now not church world, but our whole world, impacted how people act?
It's kind of brought out the worst in everybody.
Kind of brought out the worst in everybody. Well, what do you see? What do you hear? By the way, one of the problems I think we have today, some things can be a great tool that can become a terrible weapon, and social media is like that. I like Facebook because it helps me keep up with some of our friends in Illinois, helps me see what's happening in my home state of Maryland. There's some good things about it. But some people don't have a filter on what they say. And I'm not talking cussing here. I'm just talking about the criticism, the complaint. Well, what kind of things are you seeing? Are you not seeing that? And not just on Facebook, but I mean in general. And
To me, it's becoming more and more obvious all the time how insecure, ungrounded people are about what this is about.
yeah,
Just exactly what you're talking about there, Joe, and everything, but it just seems like it is completely dominating everything we see in the virus and all that stuff, Black Lives Matter and all those things going on.
okay.
Probably out of line for even thinking of suggesting this, but it kind of speaks to me, I wonder how strong our faith in him really is.
Okay.
I think we see a lot of, people saying things that may be true or posting things on Facebook that may be true, but none of it's being spoken of in love.
Right.
It's all hatred and bashing and criticizing of other people, regardless of which side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, goes both ways.
Yeah, and I think social media in general has, and text for that matter,
Mhm.
has made it very easy for us to be bold without having to take, see the person's face when we say it to them. And I think that's a huge problem.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
To that point, you don't ever hear much of anything positive about all this.
Yeah.
Everything's negative, all the trends are negative, everything's negative, and you know there's all this stuff out there. We're just not hearing about it.
Yeah. Okay. What else?
I mean, I have to admit to, reading some things that just make me ashamed, almost ashamed to be a Christian in
Yeah.
a sense.
Yeah. Let me use an illustration, and I may get into trouble here, but have you noticed, and again, I'm seeing what I see on Facebook, I am seeing people who are shaming others for not wearing a mask. Okay? I'm seeing other people shaming others for telling them they have to wear a mask. And this back and forth conflict, this battle, nobody can tell me what to do. I see people say, you can't tell me I have to wear a mask. And then somebody else saying, well, you don't care if you don't wear a mask. And it's presented in such a way that there's not love there. One of the other things that I've seen in recent years that really bothers me, and this is true often with politicians, is when they begin to call people names. When you don't have, if you listen to a political speech and he doesn't have a he or she doesn't have a platform or doesn't have a plan, they're going to call the other person by name. They're going to call them names. And I see so much of that in the political realm today, that it's not a discussion of issues, it becomes a personal attack on my opponent. I see that as a real difficulty in our culture. It is an adversarial culture where people are choosing sides. By the way, tomorrow's voting day.
I read somewhere where in Congress, they could get up on the floor and say anything that, no matter if it was, they knew it was a blatant lie, or they just make it up as they go. They could not be corrected or in a lie.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Hmm.
that's everybody in Congress and in the House. And they, you know, all agreed to that.
I've not read that, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least bit. Yeah. So, I think the present situation being the virus and all related to that, the racial issue and all related to that, the politics and all related to that, I think people have not, they've lost the ability to be gentlemen and ladies. That's one way I can put it.
I don't think that's just started.
Oh, no, it's not just started, but it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. When I was a kid, I like to use this illustration. When I was a kid, I worked in Dad's hardware store. And we had some pretty rough guys that would come into the store. They'd get shotgun shells, or they were contractors, and they're pretty rough guys. But we had female clerks, had a couple of women who worked in the store, and you didn't hear those guys using any foul language when the women were around them. Now, when it was me or my dad, they'd paint the air blue. Now it's the women who are as foul-mouthed as the men,
A little bit more so.
and maybe sometimes a little more so. Yeah.
I've worked with them, Jim and I had a customer, husband and wife come in, and they were both blue streak, as you
Yeah.
say. Pretty soon he caught on that we weren't using that language, and he quit.
Yeah.
He kept kind of nudging his wife, and
Yeah.
she just kept right on, you know. And
Well-
Jim's dad used to say to you, I'd rather you spit tobacco juice on my face than curse like that, because I can wipe the tobacco juice off.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go quite that far.
But his point was made. His
Yeah, point was made.
There was an article in the news today on TV or on phone or something. There was a man spit in the face of a little girl because she had a mask on. And he told her, he said, now, you don't have to wear that mask now because you've got it.
Hmm. That is punishable by the law.
It ought to be.
Well, it is. It is. Yeah. Yeah. If you willfully infect somebody or think you are, you can be arrested.
Yeah. In New York, if I kill you, I'll be back out on the street.
Yeah, I know.
And nobody will know nothing.
This is a broken culture. This is a broken culture, and I believe there has to be light in the darkness. Guess who that is? That's the church. Of all people, God's people, need to be examples of our words mattering. We need to be the people who speak with love, always with grace, being very careful what we say and how we say it. Sunday, in talking about the qualities that will equip us for life, we're talking about spiritual discernment. What Peter calls knowledge, and the ability to know the right thing to say at the right time is a gift that I think God gives, and I think it's a gift we need to all seek, because there are situations where just the right word can diffuse a bad situation. The wrong word can create a riot. And as Christians, we have a responsibility, I think, because our words matter so much. Okay? All right, now, 12a, have you heard more talk about the second coming since all this has been going on?
Oh, yeah.
I keep seeing things on Facebook. People are posting things, what they believe about the second coming, that it's near. Somebody was talking the other day about, that if they're going to put a chip in us, that's a sign of the end of times. And somebody else was talking about the rapture, what they believed. And I'm hearing more and more talk about that. I don't think that's bad. I think we have to be very careful. I think one of the things that has created some questions about Christianity is that Christians sometimes have made predictions that didn't come true. A lot of times. And we have to be careful about that. Truth is, we don't know that the end is near.
I think it's gonna be a lot like the first coming, in a sense, everybody, not everybody,
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it wasn't what they were looking for. They were looking for an earthly king.
Yeah.
You know, I think we could end up being in that same situation.
We'll
Not-
see.
Not that we'll technically miss it, because, I mean, it is the judgment.
Nobody's gonna miss it, yeah.
But you know what I mean, but what, all the signs and stuff
Yeah.
coming up, you know, we have this picture of how it's gonna look, and I don't think God's not gonna work according to what we.
Thank you. I agree completely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, I do think that it's healthy when problems remind us that the second coming is going to happen. But I think we have to be careful that we don't say, okay, this virus is the sign of the mark of the beast or whatever, some kind of ridiculous thing to say. So let's be careful about that. Okay? All right. Anything else about that? We're in good shape. Let's go on. All right. James comes in verse 12 now. And he says, above all, my brothers, do not swear. Now, if you may remember, Jesus said the same kind of thing in Matthew 5:33 through 37. So let me give you number 13. By swearing, James is talking about taking an oath. Taking an oath. People in Old Testament times, and even in New Testament times, would swear by the temple. I make this promise, swear by the temple. You may have heard somebody say, I swear on my mother's grave, you know, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about cussing. Now, that's in another place that it's wrong, no obscenity or foolish talk. The Bible talks about that, but that's not what James is talking about. James is talking about taking an oath. Now, is it wrong, for instance, if I am called to testify at a court of law, and raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? And I can say, yes, I can do that. I don't believe James is giving a law that says it's wrong in a court of law, because we find Jesus testified under oath when he was on trial. Okay? So I don't think James is saying if the law prescribes that, don't do it. I don't think James is saying it's wrong for me to pledge allegiance to the flag. I don't think he's saying that. Now, some people believe that. I don't believe that at all. What he's talking about is taking an oath. So, number 14, what is he talking about? The issue is honesty and integrity. The issue, what James is talking about, is honesty and integrity. He says, and Dee told me she read this last week, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Okay? So what James is talking about is honesty and integrity. As Christians, our word should be our bond. I don't need to swear on something when I tell you I'll give you a promise. A person of integrity, which we should be, their word should be good. Okay? So the issue is honesty and integrity. As Christians, our word should be our bond. Okay, so in conclusion, favorite part of everybody's study and sermon. Number 15, throughout his book, James is very concerned with our speech. How many times did we come back to talking about our words? Throughout this book, James is very concerned with our speech. He talked about the tongue, talked about being quick to listen, slow to speak, on and on it goes. So that number 15, throughout his book, James is very concerned about our speech. James 5, 7 through 12. Number 16 is an important lesson on practical Christian living. I believe it's important and good for us to study great biblical truths. I believe we need to be well schooled in study of God. But if we do that and we miss practical Christian living, we're going to get an F in the course. Because the study of God, the study of Scripture, the study of the Bible, the study of the Christian life is not just to gain knowledge. It's to learn how to live. And so what James is dealing with here is practical Christian living. Here's how we as Christians should live. And so hopefully, you know, one of the things I struggle with in preaching and teaching both, and it's really something I've dealt with more in recent years, is to make application of the message. You know, you can preach a sermon or teach a lesson and go through and teach all these wonderful truths, but the question that I have to ask myself is, so what? So I've studied this tonight, so what? What does it mean? What should it do? What should it accomplish in my life and in your life? Well, obviously there are several things. It should help us understand a little better how to deal with our own suffering and problems. It hopefully would help us a little bit know how to help other people who are hurting. It should help us understand how to treat people when we're hurting. And it should help us understand about the importance of honesty and integrity, and what that means is that let me use an illustration. I had to do something several years ago to help me, because people were always coming to me and telling me about sickness or difficulty or something. And you know the natural response that I would always give? What was it? I'll pray for you. I found myself realizing a week or two later, oh, I forgot. I didn't pray for them. Now, did I mean I was going to do it? Yes. So I've had to start writing down to remind me when I tell somebody I'm going to pray for them that I'm going to do it. Because someday I'm going to answer to God, but someday one of them may say to me, Drew, did you pray for me? And I'm going to either say no or yes. And so I try to make notes and not lose the notes when I tell somebody I'm going to pray for them. Why? Because I said it, so my word should be good. I'm still working on that, because I do forget sometimes, okay? But not intentionally. All right, questions or comments? Well, thank you, folks. It's good to see all of you tonight. Beautiful day today. Oh, my. Yes, it was. Let's pray. Father, I do pray that some things we've talked about tonight would be helpful to all of us in different ways. You know that there are areas that we struggle with, and you know there are areas where we're strong. You know there are times when we're hurting, there are times when we're happy. You know that life is sometimes so changing. I just pray that you'd help us in every situation to seek your will and to live as you'd have us live. Thank you for letting us be together. Thank you for this church, for its rich history, and for its great future. Thank you for the work you continue to do here. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, folks. Good to see y'all.